Imagine commanding a nuclear submarine for 60 days, believing you're invisible in the ocean's depths, only to discover an enemy submarine was following you the entire time, close enough to touch, close enough to kill. This actually happened, and when Soviet captains learned the truth, it shattered everything they believed about the Cold War underwater. Vladivostok Naval Base, Soviet Pacific Fleet Headquarters, March 14, 1986. Captain First Rank Viktor Kuznetsov stepped onto the concrete pier with the confidence of a man who had just completed the perfect mission. Behind him, the massive black hull of K-219, a Delta III class ballistic missile submarine, sat low in the gray water like a sleeping leviathan. 60 days, 2 months beneath the waves of the Sea of Okhotsk and the North Pacific, carrying 16 RSM-50 ballistic missiles, each with 4 nuclear warheads. 60 days of silence, discipline, and invisibility. The welcoming committee stood in formation, as was tradition for returning strategic submarines. Junior officers saluted crisply. The base commander offered the ritual handshake and words of commendation. Victor accepted them with the practiced humility of a veteran who had completed 17 such patrols in his 22-year career. His executive officer, Captain Second Rank Dmitry Volkov, walked beside him toward the administration building, both men still adjusting to the sensation of solid ground after 2 months in 3-dimensional fluid space. We were ghosts, Victor thought as they walked. The Americans had their satellites, their aircraft, their surface ships endlessly circling, searching, listening. But once a Soviet submarine slipped beneath the thermocline, once it descended into the crushing darkness of the deep ocean, it became invisible, untouchable. The ultimate weapon of deterrence, hidden in plain sight beneath millions of square kilometers of water. Every patrol was a silent declaration. Try to find us, try to stop us, and you will fail. The ocean is vast, and we are silent. That confidence, that bone-deep certainty, would be shattered 48 hours later. The summons arrived by courier at Victor's apartment on the base. A sealed envelope with the unmistakable markings of GRU, Military Intelligence. Report to Compound 7 at 0800 hours, March 16th. Dress uniform. Classification level. Special importance. The instruction was terse, offering no explanation, but Victor had been in the Navy long enough to recognize the weight of such orders. Compound 7 was where secrets went to live or die, where careers were elevated or terminated with clinical efficiency. He arrived 15 minutes early, as protocol demanded, and found himself in a waiting room with 11 other submarine captains. Victor recognized most of them, commanders of Delta and Yankee-class boats, veterans like himself, men whose faces showed the peculiar pallor that came from spending months away from sunlight. They nodded to each other but did not speak. Whatever this was, it demanded the silence of uncertainty. At precisely 0800, a junior officer opened the inner door and called them into a conference room that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and floor polish. The table was long, dark wood, surrounded by chairs that had seen decades of classified briefings. At the head sat Admiral Konstantin Volkov, commander of submarine operations for the Pacific Fleet, his uniform heavy with decorations earned in the unforgiving theater of underwater warfare. Beside him sat 2 men in civilian clothes whose bearing screamed intelligence services. Admiral Volkov waited until all 12 captains were seated, then placed a thick folder on the table in front of him. The room was absolutely silent except for the hum of ventilation and the distant sound of machinery from the base outside. When Volkov finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. What you are about to see will fundamentally change how you understand every patrol you have ever commanded. Some of you may question what I am about to show you. Some of you may refuse to believe it. But I assure you, every piece of evidence has been verified through multiple intelligence sources. What we are facing is not a temporary problem. It is a systemic failure that goes to the heart of our strategic nuclear deterrent. He opened the folder and began distributing photographs, sliding them across the polished wood surface. Victor caught his first image and felt his stomach drop as if the floor had suddenly given way. It was a photograph taken through a periscope, the distinctive crosshairs visible in the frame, but the subject of the photograph made his breath catch in his throat. It was K-219, his submarine. The image showed the vessel's propeller assembly in sharp detail, captured from directly behind, close enough to see the specific pattern of damage on the lower blade that Victor had reported to maintenance after his previous patrol, close enough to see the hull number partially visible beneath layers of anti-fouling paint, close enough to count the rivets. Victor's hands began to shake. He forced them still, forced himself to look at the next photograph. Same perspective, same submarine, but the lighting was different, suggesting a different time of day filtering down through the surface layers. The timestamp in the corner read, Day 23 of his patrol. He remembered that day. They had been at depth, running silent, confident in their invisibility. The next photograph showed K-219 from a slightly different angle. Day 37. His birthday. He had celebrated that evening with his officers, a small cake and a toast, believing they were utterly alone in the ocean's embrace. The American submarine had been 40 meters away, watching. Photograph after photograph. Day 12, Day 29, Day 45, Day 58, just 2 days before returning to port. An entire patrol, documented from behind, through crosshairs by an enemy that had remained completely invisible to every sensor system K-219 possessed. Admiral Volkov's voice cut through the stunned silence. These photographs were taken by USS Parche, a Sturgeon-class attack submarine, under the command of Commander Daniel Kursick. Intelligence indicates that Parche shadowed K-219 for the entire duration of your last patrol, Captain Kuznetsov. Distance, estimated between 40 and 60 meters, positioned directly in your baffle zone. Your sonar never detected them because they were in the one place your systems cannot see, the blind spot created by your own propeller noise. Victor wanted to object, wanted to insist that it was impossible, that their sonar operators were trained to rotate the submarine periodically to clear the baffles, to ensure nothing could hide in that acoustic shadow. But the photographs did not lie. The evidence was irrefutable. You are not alone, Volkov continued, his gaze sweeping across the 12 captains. Every man in this room commanded a patrol in the last 8 months. Every one of you was shadowed. We have confirmation of American attack submarines trailing at least 15 Soviet strategic submarines in the last year alone. Intelligence estimates suggest the actual number may be significantly higher. The room erupted in controlled chaos, captains speaking over each other, voices tight with disbelief and barely contained anger. How was this possible? Why were they not informed? What did this mean for their missions, for their crews, for the entire strategic submarine force? Volkov raised a hand and the room fell silent. It means, he said quietly, that every assumption we have made about the survivability of our sea-based nuclear deterrent has been compromised. It means the Americans have known the exact position of a significant portion of our SSBN fleet at all times. It means that in the event of war, those submarines would have been destroyed before they could launch their missiles. It means, gentlemen, that we have been operating under a dangerous illusion of security. Victor felt the room tilt slightly, the way it did when K-219 took an unexpected down angle. His entire career, his entire understanding of submarine warfare, had been built on fundamental principles: stealth through silence, security through the vastness of the ocean, deterrence through invisibility. If American submarines could shadow Soviet boats for entire patrols without detection, then those principles were not just flawed, they were fiction. One of the civilian intelligence officers stood and began arranging additional materials on the table: technical diagrams, acoustic analysis charts, comparative data on Soviet and American submarine construction. He was a slight man with glasses that reflected the fluorescent lighting, and when he spoke, his voice carried the clinical detachment of a scientist delivering bad news about an incurable disease. To understand how this happened, we must first understand the fundamental difference between Soviet and American submarine design philosophy. Our approach has always emphasized capability, speed, depth, weapons payload. We built submarines that could dive deeper than American boats, submarines with titanium hulls that could withstand pressures no Western submarine could match, submarines fast enough to chase down aircraft carriers. We built submarines designed to win in direct confrontation. The Americans built submarines designed never to be found in the first place. He tapped a diagram showing cross-sections of Soviet and American reactor designs. Our propulsion systems are powerful and reliable, but they are loud. Reactor coolant pumps are mounted directly to the hull structure because it is simpler, more robust, more resistant to damage. But every vibration from those pumps transmits directly into the water. Our propellers are designed for maximum thrust, which means they operate at speeds that create cavitation, tiny bubbles that form and collapse, and each collapse produces noise. Our machinery spaces use rigid mounting systems because they are proven, tested, and easy to maintain. But rigid mounts transmit vibrations efficiently, and those vibrations radiate into the ocean as sound. He pulled out another diagram, this one showing an American Los Angeles-class submarine. American submarines use a technique called rafting. All major machinery, the reactor pumps, the turbines, the reduction gears, everything is mounted on rubber and spring isolators that absorb vibrations before they reach the hull. Their propellers use 7 blades instead of our 5, a configuration that reduces cavitation significantly. Their hulls are coated with anechoic tiles, rubber compounds that absorb active sonar pulses instead of reflecting them. At low speeds, their reactors can operate on natural circulation, where temperature differences move the coolant without pumps, eliminating that noise source entirely. The result? A typical Soviet SSBN operating at patrol speed radiates approximately 160 decibels. An American Los Angeles-class submarine at the same speed radiates approximately 120 decibels. That difference sounds small, but decibels are logarithmic. A 20 decibel difference means the American submarine is 100 times quieter, 100 times harder to detect, 100 times closer to invisible. Victor stared at the charts, his mind struggling to process the implications. He had always known American submarines were quiet. That was acknowledged in every intelligence briefing, every tactical manual. But knowing something intellectually, and seeing the mathematical proof of your obsolescence laid out in charts and photographs, were entirely different experiences. Admiral Volkov took over again, his voice heavy. The tactic they use is called riding the baffles. Every submarine has a blind spot directly behind it, created by the acoustic interference from its own propeller. Our doctrine calls for periodic baffle clearing, turning the submarine to sweep that zone with our sonar arrays. But the Americans have perfected the art of staying in that blind spot even during maneuvers. They match our speed, they match our depth changes, they mirror every turn. When we clear our baffles by turning, they turn with us, maintaining position in the zone our sensors cannot see. One of the captains, a veteran commander named Petrov, spoke up, his voice rough. How long have they been doing this? How many patrols have been compromised? Volkov exchanged glances with the intelligence officers. We have confirmed cases dating back to 1969. USS Lapon shadowed a Yankee-class submarine for 47 consecutive days without being detected even once. USS Pintado, USS Tautog, USS Parche, USS Batfish, multiple American attack submarines conducting extended surveillance operations. Intelligence estimates suggest at least 40% of our SSBN patrols over the last 15 years have been shadowed for significant portions of their deployment. 40%. Victor felt something cold settle in his chest. 40% of the Soviet Union's sea-based nuclear deterrent compromised. 40% of their second strike capability under constant surveillance. The entire logic of mutual assured destruction depended on the certainty that enough weapons would survive a first strike to guarantee unacceptable retaliation. But if the Americans knew exactly where Soviet submarines were at all times, if they could destroy them before those missiles launched, then MAD was not mutual. It was one-sided suicide. The intelligence officer continued, pulling out more documentation. The Americans do not merely follow our submarines. They collect intelligence on everything. They record the acoustic signature, the unique sound fingerprint of each vessel, which allows them to identify specific submarines in the future. They observe operational patterns, patrol routes, communication schedules, transit times. They monitor crew watch schedules, noting when alertness might be reduced. They even collect water samples from our reactor coolant discharge to analyze our nuclear fuel composition and reactor operating temperatures. But the most valuable intelligence is strategic. By tracking our SSBNs, they map our patrol areas. They understand our targeting doctrine. They identify our launch baskets, the geographic zones from which our missiles can reach specific targets. They know which submarines are assigned to strike the American East Coast, which are targeting Pacific Fleet bases, which are held in reserve for secondary strikes. They have built a complete picture of our sea-based nuclear posture, and we gave it to them simply by going on patrol. The briefing continued for another 2 hours, each revelation more disturbing than the last. The Americans had tapped underwater communication cables in the Sea of Okhotsk, installing recording devices that transmitted Soviet naval communications directly to American intelligence. They had positioned seafloor sensor arrays called SOSUS that formed a network of hydrophones across strategic choke points, creating acoustic tripwires that detected Soviet submarines leaving port. They had submarines equipped with specialized intelligence collection equipment that could photograph Soviet boats underwater, measure magnetic signatures, even recover debris from the ocean floor. Every technological advantage the Soviet Union believed it possessed, speed, depth, endurance, was negated by American stealth. And stealth was not something that could be overcome through courage or determination. It was a fundamental physics problem, and the Americans had solved it while the Soviet Union was still catching up. When the briefing finally ended, Viktor walked out into the weak sunlight of early spring, feeling as though he had aged a decade in a single morning. Dmitri, his executive officer, walked beside him, equally shaken. "What do we do now?" Dmitri asked quietly. "How do we conduct patrols knowing they might be following us every moment?" Viktor did not have an answer. What could you do when the enemy was invisible, when your sensors were useless, when the vast ocean offered no sanctuary? The only honest answer was that they would continue to go on patrol because that was their duty, because the strategic deterrent had to be maintained even if it was compromised, because stopping would be an admission of complete defeat. But he would never feel safe underwater again. Every unexplained noise, every sonar contact that appeared and vanished, every thermal layer shift would carry the whisper of doubt. Are they there? Are they watching? How close are they? The Cold War beneath the waves had always been a silent struggle, a chess game played in darkness where neither side could see the full board. But Viktor was beginning to understand that the Americans had been playing with marked cards all along, that they could see every piece, anticipate every move, while the Soviets played blind. 3 weeks later, Viktor sat in the intelligence library at the base, surrounded by technical manuals and classified reports, trying to understand exactly how the technology gap had grown so wide. The answer, when he finally pieced it together, was both simple and damning. The Soviet Union had always approached submarine design as an engineering problem. Build something fast, strong, capable. American submarine design was a systems engineering problem. Build something that integrated every component, every technology, every scientific discipline into a unified whole optimized for a single purpose, remaining undetected. Soviet submarines used 5-bladed propellers because that was what had always been used, because the design was proven and reliable. American submarines used 7-bladed propellers because computer modeling had shown that the additional blades reduced cavitation, and reducing cavitation was worth the added complexity. Soviet submarines mounted machinery directly to hull frames because it was simpler and easier to maintain. American submarines mounted everything on rubber rafts and spring isolators because acoustic modeling showed that vibration isolation was critical to stealth, and stealth was worth the maintenance burden. Soviet submarines used reactor designs that required constant coolant pumping because those reactors were powerful and had excellent performance characteristics. American submarines accepted slightly reduced reactor performance in exchange for natural circulation capability at low speeds, because operating silently was more important than maximum power output. Every decision in American submarine design asked the same question: does this reduce our acoustic signature? If the answer was no, the feature was redesigned or eliminated, regardless of tradition or convenience. The result was submarines that were effectively invisible to Soviet sensors, but the technological gap went deeper than hardware. It was a computational gap, an informational gap that reflected the broader struggle between Soviet central planning and American innovation economy. Designing a truly quiet submarine required acoustic modeling at a level of complexity that demanded significant computing power. Every hull shape, every propeller configuration, every machinery mounting system had to be simulated, tested virtually before physical prototypes were built. The Americans had invested heavily in supercomputing specifically for this purpose, building machines that could run millions of calculations to optimize every acoustic parameter. The Soviet Union had supercomputers, but they were allocated primarily to nuclear weapons design and ballistic missile calculations, priorities that consumed available computing resources. Submarine acoustic optimization was important, but it competed with dozens of other defense priorities for limited computational capacity. The result was that Soviet submarine designers relied more on physical testing and iterative development, a slower and less precise process. Material science was another critical gap. American anechoic tiles, the rubber coatings that absorbed sonar pulses, required specialized polymer chemistry and manufacturing precision that Soviet industry struggled to replicate. The Americans could produce tiles with carefully controlled acoustic properties, tuned to absorb specific frequencies. Soviet attempts to copy those tiles often resulted in coatings that degraded quickly in seawater or failed to provide the same acoustic dampening. Even basic metallurgy played a role. Soviet steel production, while capable of producing the high-strength alloys needed for submarine hulls, had inconsistency problems. Variations in metal composition meant variations in acoustic properties, making it harder to predict and control sound transmission through the hull structure. The cumulative effect of these technological gaps was measured in decibels, but the strategic impact was measured in deterrence credibility. If Soviet submarines could not hide from American attack submarines, then the entire premise of sea-based nuclear deterrence was questionable. Victor found a report on Soviet attempts to acquire American submarine propeller technology. In the early 1980s, a Japanese company, Toshiba Machine, had sold the Soviet Union precision milling equipment capable of manufacturing multi-axis propeller blades similar to American designs. It was a major intelligence coup, or so it seemed at the time. But the equipment alone was not enough. American propellers were not just precisely shaped, they were precisely shaped according to computer models that optimized blade geometry for minimum cavitation at specific speeds and depths. The Soviets had the manufacturing capability, but lacked the complete acoustic modeling data that informed the design. Their attempts to reverse engineer American propellers resulted in copies that were better than previous Soviet designs, but still inferior to the originals, still 20 decibels louder, still detectable. It was like trying to recreate a symphony by only hearing the final performance, without access to the sheet music or understanding of the compositional theory behind it. You could approximate the sound, but you could never replicate the precision. The more Victor read, the more he understood that this was not a problem that could be solved quickly. The American advantage in submarine stealth was not a single technological breakthrough that could be stolen or copied. It was a systemic advantage built over decades, incorporating advances in computing, materials science, acoustic physics, manufacturing precision, and systems engineering. Closing that gap would require the Soviet Union to match American capabilities in all of those fields simultaneously, and the Soviet economy was already straining under the burden of military spending. The invasion of Afghanistan was draining resources. The nuclear arms race demanded constant investment in new missiles, new warheads, new delivery systems. The Red Army required modernization to counter NATO forces in Europe. The Air Force needed new fighters to match American developments. Every branch of the military was competing for limited resources, and submarine acoustic stealth was just one priority among many. The brutal calculus was simple. The Soviet Union could not afford to match American submarine technology, could not afford the computing infrastructure, the materials research, the manufacturing precision, the decades of iterative development that stealth submarines required. They would have to work with what they had, submarines that were fast and powerful but fundamentally detectable, and hope that numbers and operational doctrine could compensate for technological inferiority. But hope was not strategy, and Victor knew it. In October 1987, Victor received orders for another patrol. K2-19 had been refitted, minor repairs and system updates, and was scheduled for a 3-month deployment to the North Atlantic. Standard deterrent patrol, standard operational procedures, standard mission profile. Nothing unusual except that Victor could not stop thinking about the photographs, could not stop imagining an American submarine settling into his baffle zone the moment K2-19 cleared the Kuril Islands. The departure was routine, the submarine sliding beneath the gray Pacific waters with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had done this hundreds of times. But Victor found himself hyper-aware of every sonar contact, every unexplained noise, every thermal layer transition that might hide a pursuing enemy. On day 4 of the patrol, the sonar operator reported a transient contact, a brief noise signature that appeared and vanished too quickly to classify. Biological, the operator assessed, probably a whale. Victor ordered a baffle-clearing maneuver anyway, turning K2-19 30 degrees to sweep the blind zone with their flank sonar array. Nothing. Empty ocean. He resumed course, but the doubt remained. On day 11, they detected what might have been another submarine, a contact at extreme range that faded into the background noise of the ocean before they could get a solid classification. American attack submarine possible, or a surface ship propeller, or acoustic interference from a seamount. The ocean was full of sounds, and interpreting them was as much art as science. By day 20, Victor realized he was seeing threats everywhere. Every watch brought another marginal contact, another possible shadow. His officers noticed. The crew noticed. Morale began to suffer under the weight of their captain's paranoia. Dmitri finally confronted him in the wardroom during a quiet watch. "You cannot continue like this. The crew is starting to question whether you trust them, whether you trust the boat. We are making ourselves jumpy, degrading our own effectiveness." Victor wanted to argue, wanted to insist that heightened vigilance was appropriate given what they now knew about American capabilities. But Dmitri was right. He was allowing fear to compromise his command, allowing the possibility of surveillance to undermine the crew's confidence. What he did not know, what he could not know, was that an American submarine was indeed following K2-19, had been following since day 2 of the patrol. USS Augusta, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, was positioned 55 meters behind them, perfectly centered in the baffle zone, matching every course change, every depth excursion, every speed variation. The American crew had been tracking K2-19 with passive sonar, listening to the distinctive acoustic signature of a Delta III class submarine, a sound fingerprint as unique as a human voice. The Americans knew that Soviet submarine commanders were now aware of shadowing operations. Intelligence reports indicated that Soviet crews were nervous, conducting more frequent baffle-clearing maneuvers, more aggressive anti-submarine tactics. But knowing about American capabilities and being able to counter them were very different things. Soviet submarines were still too loud, their sensors still inadequate, their operational doctrine still built on assumptions that no longer held. Commander James Riker, captain of USS Augusta, Watched through his periscope as K-219 conducted another clearing turn, the massive Soviet submarine rotating slowly, its sonar arrays sweeping the water in search of threats. Augusta turned with it, maintaining position, a ghost that refused to materialize. Riker had conducted 5 previous surveillance operations, shadowing Soviet submarines for extended periods, and the procedure had become almost routine. Stay in the baffles, match their maneuvers, minimize your own noise, and the ocean would keep your secret. On day 37 of the patrol, K-219 developed a problem. One of the missile tubes, Tube 6, began showing abnormal pressure readings. The seals were degrading, allowing seawater to seep in, and seawater mixing with missile fuel was a recipe for catastrophe. Victor ordered the tube isolated, the missile safe-checked, and initiated emergency procedures to stabilize the situation. USS Augusta detected the change immediately. The Soviet submarine's maneuvering became erratic. The acoustic signature shifted as internal systems reconfigured. Riker pulled back, increasing distance to avoid detection during what was clearly a mechanical crisis aboard the Soviet boat. American doctrine was clear: observe, record, do not interfere. They were intelligence collectors, not combatants. The crew of K-219 worked for 18 hours straight to contain the problem, flooding the tube with inert gas, isolating the missile, monitoring the situation. Victor made the decision to abort the patrol and return to base. A missile tube casualty was serious enough to justify ending the mission, and he was not going to risk his crew by continuing with compromised systems. USS Augusta followed them home, documenting the emergency surfacing procedures, the transit route, the escort vessels that met K-219 as it approached Soviet territorial waters. Then Augusta peeled away, disappearing into the deep water of the Pacific, and began the long transit back to Pearl Harbor. Commander Riker would file a detailed report on the surveillance operation. 71 days of continuous tracking, complete acoustic profile of target, observation of emergency procedures and damage control protocols, confirmation of patrol route and operational patterns. Intelligence value, high. Another piece in the massive puzzle of Soviet submarine operations, another data point in understanding their capabilities and vulnerabilities. Victor would never know how close they had been, would never know that his paranoia was justified, that the ghost in his baffles was real and had watched them struggle with the missile tube casualty from 50 meters away. K-219 returned to Vladivostok on December 3, 1987. The submarine went into immediate dry dock for repairs. The missile tube was stripped and rebuilt, and Victor filed his patrol report with the quiet dread of a man who knew his invisible enemy had been there, watching, the entire time. The years following the revelations of American submarine surveillance operations were difficult for the Soviet submarine force. Morale suffered. Captains questioned their training, their equipment, their entire operational doctrine. Some refused to believe the intelligence reports, insisting that Soviet submarines were still effective, that the Americans were exaggerating their capabilities to undermine Soviet confidence. Others fell into fatalism, viewing every patrol as a rehearsal for inevitable defeat. The Soviet Navy tried to adapt. They developed new tactics, more aggressive baffle-clearing procedures, irregular maneuvering designed to shake potential shadows, deployment of towed sonar arrays that could potentially detect submarines in the baffle zone. But every countermeasure had limitations and none addressed the fundamental problem. Soviet submarines were too loud. Research programs were initiated to develop quieter propulsion systems, better anechoic coatings, improved acoustic isolation. Progress was made, incrementally, but the gap remained. American submarine technology continued to advance, each new class incorporating lessons learned from previous designs, each generation quieter than the last. The economic burden became unsustainable. The Soviet Union was spending enormous resources trying to maintain strategic parity with the United States across nuclear weapons, conventional forces, space programs, and now submarine technology. Something had to give, and increasingly it was the Soviet economy itself that was cracking under the strain. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended not with nuclear fire, but with economic exhaustion and political disintegration. The submarine warfare gap was one of many factors, one of many technological and economic competitions that the Soviet system could not win. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, American submarine commanders began publishing memoirs, revealing details of operations that had been classified for decades. The stories confirmed everything Soviet intelligence had feared and more. American submarines had routinely operated in Soviet territorial waters, had photographed Soviet submarines in their home ports, had conducted surveillance operations so aggressive that collisions were narrowly avoided on multiple occasions. Captain First Rank Viktor Kuznetsov, retired by then, read those memoirs with a mixture of vindication and bitterness. Vindication because his paranoia had been justified. There had been ghosts in his baffles, watching, tracking, targeting. Bitterness because his entire career, 26 years of service, had been built on an illusion of effectiveness that was shattered by photographs taken from 50 meters away. He was not alone. Hundreds of Soviet submarine commanders had similar experiences. The slow realization that their service, their sacrifice, their years away from family and sunlight had been conducted under conditions of permanent compromise. They had been brave men in obsolete machines, playing a game where the opposing team could see every card in their hand. The human cost extended beyond wounded pride. Submarine service had always been dangerous, but the aggressive tactics employed by both sides during the Cold War increased the risks significantly. K-219 itself would be lost in 1986 when a missile tube explosion forced an emergency surface and eventual sinking. 28 crew members survived. 4 did not, including Seaman Sergei Preminin, who remained at his post to prevent a reactor meltdown, drowning when the submarine sank before he could escape. How many accidents were influenced by the constant stress of surveillance operations, by aggressive maneuvering in close proximity to enemy submarines, by the psychological toll of operating under permanent uncertainty? The question could not be answered definitively, but the correlation was undeniable. American submarines had their own casualties. USS Scorpion was lost in 1968 with all 99 crew members. The exact cause never fully determined, but possibly related to aggressive operations near Soviet submarines. USS Guitarro sank pierside in 1969 due to human error during construction, a reminder that even superior technology required human competence. The Cold War beneath the waves extracted costs from both sides. But the strategic outcome was clear. American submarine technology had achieved a level of stealth that Soviet systems could not match, and that technological advantage translated directly into strategic advantage. Soviet sea-based nuclear deterrent was compromised, vulnerable to preemptive attack in ways that undermined the entire logic of mutually assured destruction. Victor attended a reunion of submarine veterans in 1995, a gathering of men who had served on everything from diesel boats to nuclear giants, men who had spent their lives in the unforgiving environment beneath the waves. They were older now, gray-haired, some using canes, all carrying the physical marks of a career spent in cramped spaces breathing recycled air. The conversation inevitably turned to the American surveillance operations, the photographs, the revelations that had come out in the years since the Soviet collapse. One veteran, a captain who had commanded a Yankee-class boat, expressed what many felt. "We were betrayed by our own government," he said quietly. "They sent us on patrol in submarines they knew were obsolete, with sensors they knew were inadequate, against an enemy they knew was superior. They sent us out to die and called it deterrence." Victor understood the anger but could not entirely share it. The Soviet leadership had been trapped by the same limitations as the submarine force: inadequate technology, insufficient resources, a system that could not innovate fast enough to keep pace with American developments. Sending submarines on patrol despite their vulnerabilities was not betrayal. It was desperation, the last option of a system that had run out of good choices. But the emotional truth remained. Soviet submariners had served believing they were invisible predators, apex hunters in the ocean's depths. The discovery that they had been prey all along, tracked and targeted by enemies they could not see, was a psychological wound that never fully healed. The legacy of Cold War submarine operations extended into the modern era. Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, continued to operate strategic submarines, continued to conduct deterrent patrols, continued the silent struggle beneath the waves. But the lessons of American technological superiority were not forgotten. Modern Russian submarines incorporated stealth features, acoustic dampening, advanced propeller designs, all attempting to close the gap that had proven so devastating during the Cold War. American submarines continued to evolve as well, each generation quieter, more capable, more difficult to detect. The Virginia-class submarines incorporated technologies that would have seemed impossible during the Cold War. Pump jet propulsion systems that eliminated propeller noise entirely. Acoustic coatings so effective they approached theoretical limits of absorption. Operational quietness levels below ambient ocean noise in some frequency ranges. The technological competition continued because the strategic logic remained. Submarines with ballistic missiles represented a survivable nuclear deterrent, but only if they could remain undetected. Stealth was not optional, it was existential. Viktor Kuznetsov died in 2008 at age 71, of heart failure related to decades of submarine service. His funeral was attended by former crew members, fellow submarine commanders, and a few American naval officers who had come to respect the courage of men who served in inferior equipment against superior opponents. One of those American officers was Commander James Riker, retired, who had captained USS Augusta during that 71-day surveillance operation in 1987. He and Victor had never met during the Cold War, had never spoken, had never even seen each other except as sensor contacts and shadows. But Riker had read Victor's service record, made public after his death, and recognized the date range of one particular patrol. Riker attended the funeral not to gloat, not to claim victory, but to pay respects to an enemy who had served with honor in a struggle neither side fully controlled. The Cold War beneath the waves had been a war of systems and technology, not of individual courage or competence. Victor had been a skilled commander operating within the constraints of his equipment and doctrine, and the fact that those constraints proved inadequate did not diminish his service. After the funeral, Riker spoke briefly with Dmitry Volkov, Victor's former executive officer, now an old man himself. They stood in the cold wind coming off the Pacific, two veterans of a silent war that most people never knew was being fought. Did he ever speak about it? Riker asked. About knowing he was being followed? Dmitry nodded slowly. Every patrol after that briefing, he would spend hours reviewing sonar logs, analyzing every contact, every noise. He never trusted the silence again. He knew something was out there, but our equipment could not find it. That knowledge ate at him for the rest of his life. Riker felt a complicated emotion, something between guilt and vindication. He had done his duty, had conducted his surveillance operations according to doctrine, had helped maintain American strategic superiority. But standing at the funeral of a man he had stalked through the ocean for 2 months, he could not help but wonder about the human cost of that superiority. I was there, Riker admitted quietly. 1987, that patrol where he had the missile tube casualty. We followed him for 71 days. He conducted 17 baffle-clearing maneuvers, and we evaded every one. He never knew how close we were. Dmitry closed his eyes briefly, processing the information. 71 days. Victor had been right to be paranoid. The ghost in the baffles had been real. Did it matter? Dmitry asked. All of it. The surveillance, the technological race, the decades of silent stalking. Did it actually prevent war? Or was it just another way for both sides to hurt each other without firing shots? Riker considered the question carefully. Mutually assured destruction worked because both sides believed the other could not prevent retaliation. If Soviet submarines had been truly invisible, if they had been as effective as Soviet propaganda claimed, maybe deterrence would have been stronger. Or maybe it would have made Soviet leadership more aggressive, more willing to risk confrontation. There is no way to know. The only certain thing is that we played a game where the stakes were civilizational extinction, and we played it with submarines that could destroy the world but could not hide from each other. That should terrify everyone. The two men stood in silence, watching the gray Pacific waves break against the shore, thinking about the ghosts that still haunted those waters, the submarines that had prowled the depths for decades, the men who had served in them knowing or not knowing that they were being watched, tracked, targeted. The Cold War ended without the nuclear exchange that submarines were designed to deliver or prevent. In that sense, deterrence worked. But the cost of maintaining that deterrence, the psychological toll, the accidents, the near misses, the decades of fear and suspicion, could never be fully calculated. Viktor Kuznetsov had spent 60 days in command of 16 nuclear missiles, believing he was invisible, believing he controlled the ultimate weapon. The discovery that he had been visible all along, that an enemy submarine had tracked him for every moment of that patrol, had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of his service and his sacrifice. That shattering was replicated across the Soviet submarine force, across hundreds of commanders who learned the same terrible truth. They had been ghosts to themselves, but never to the enemy. They had been watched, measured, recorded, and had they ever launched their missiles, they would have been destroyed before the weapons cleared their tubes. The photographs on Admiral Volkov's conference table in March 1986 were more than just evidence of surveillance. They were proof that the technological competition between the United States and the Soviet Union was not evenly matched, that stealth had proven more powerful than speed, that silence had defeated strength. They were the visual record of a defeat that occurred entirely in darkness, beneath the waves, where no one could see and few would ever understand. Vladivostok Naval Base, March 14, 1986. Captain First Rank Viktor Kuznetsov stepped onto the pier, confident he had completed the perfect patrol. Behind him, the black hull of K-219 sat low in the water. Ahead of him in 48 hours lay photographs that would change everything he believed about submarine warfare, about deterrence, about the Cold War itself. In those photographs, crosshairs centered on his submarine, timestamps marking every day of his patrol, evidence that he had never been alone, had never been safe, had never been invisible, evidence that the ocean's vastness offered no sanctuary when the enemy was quieter than the sea itself. The most terrifying moment was not seeing those photographs. It was the realization that every patrol he had ever commanded, every moment of confidence, every assumption of security, had been an illusion. He had been a dead man sailing, carrying weapons he would never launch, commanding a submarine that was already targeted, already defeated. The Americans had followed him for 60 days straight, and he had never known. That was the horror. Not the capability itself, but the certainty it created. In the war beneath the waves, the Soviets had already lost, and most of them did not even know it yet. The Cold War had many fronts, many battlefields, many competitions. But in the silent depths of the ocean, in the three-dimensional darkness where submarines hunted each other with sound and stealth, the outcome was never in doubt. American submarines were ghosts. Soviet submarines were targets. And between those two realities lay the psychological devastation of men like Viktor Kuznetsov, who dedicated their lives to a mission that was compromised from the beginning. That was the true legacy of Cold War submarine warfare. Not the missiles that were never launched, not the torpedoes that were never fired, but the silent humiliation of warriors who discovered, too late, that they had been fighting with obsolete weapons against an invisible enemy who had been watching them all along. The photographs proved it. The statistics confirmed it. The memoirs documented it. And the veterans carried that knowledge to their graves, the bitter understanding that courage and dedication could not overcome technological inferiority, that bravery meant nothing when the enemy could see you and you could not see them. Soviet captains were horrified to learn a U.S. ghost had been tailing them for 60 days straight. But the deeper horror was not the tailing itself. It was the question it raised about every other patrol, every other mission, every other moment spent in command of a submarine that was supposed to be invisible, but was actually as conspicuous as a lighthouse in fog. How many times had they been followed? How many American submarines had they passed within torpedo range, never knowing? How many times had they been seconds away from destruction, saved only by the Americans' decision not to fire? Those questions had no answers, only implications, and those implications destroyed the comfortable certainty that had sustained the Soviet submarine force through decades of Cold War service. They had been professionals executing their missions with precision and discipline. But they had been professionals using equipment that was fundamentally inadequate against an opponent who had solved problems the Soviets did not even know existed. The Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but the technological competition that defined submarine warfare continued. Russian submarines became quieter. American submarines became even quieter still, and the silent struggle beneath the waves persisted because the strategic logic persisted. Survivable nuclear deterrent required submarines, and submarines required stealth, and stealth required technology that many nations still could not master. But for the veterans of that Cold War competition, for men like Viktor Kuznetsov, who lived through the revelation of how thoroughly they had been compromised, the lesson was personal and permanent. In war, technological superiority could be more decisive than courage, more important than tactics, more fundamental than training. The Americans had better submarines, and that simple fact had determined the outcome of the underwater Cold War long before anyone fired a shot. The ghost in the baffles was real. The nightmare of being followed for 60 days without knowing was real, and the horror of discovering that reality, years after the fact, was something that no amount of professional stoicism could fully erase. It marked a generation of submarine commanders, a scar on the collective memory of the Soviet submarine force, a reminder that wars could be won and lost in silence, in darkness, beneath the waves where no one could see but everyone could hear, except the Americans. They had learned how not to be heard, and that made all the difference. If you found this story as chilling as we did, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you never miss our deep dives into the hidden battles of the Cold War. Hit that like button if you enjoyed learning about these underwater ghost operations, and drop a comment below telling us, what other Cold War secrets do you want us to uncover? Your engagement helps us bring more of these incredible historical stories to light. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.